particularly exciting to welcome you to what I think is a really pioneering, cutting-edge idea of integrating studies beginning with your freshman year. Now, as I'm going to give a lecture, as I've done for many years of my life, but I've never given this lecture before, and there's something very exciting to me about it. What I'm going to tell you, though, is as I'm talking to you, I want you to be thinking of questions for me, because I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions, and part of what I want to hear is what's on your mind as you're thinking about engaging in this pioneering enterprise. So I'm going to begin by questioning you. And this is not a quiz that has a right or wrong answer, but it's going to give me a sense of what you're thinking. So integrated studies and the world that we live in is really coming to terms with an explosion of knowledge. You have more knowledge at your fingertips than I had when I was in your position as a freshman in college. And so that's the good news. The good or bad news, depending on the way you look at it, is you also have bigger problems to solve than I or any previous generation had to solve. So here's my question to you, and I want to see a show of hands. If you had to choose in your education, and I'm making you choose now, between getting as many facts and as much empirical knowledge as you possibly could in your 4 years at Penn. Don't put up your hands yet, because you have to hear the choice. How many of you would choose that versus if your choice is getting as much theoretical knowledge, as much understanding of methods and theory and principles as possible? Given it's not an unreasonable choice for me to give you to make, because you can't learn everything. So I want to see a show of hands. How many would go for as much facts and empirical knowledge as possible? One, okay. I see about 7 hands up. How many for as much theoretical principled knowledge as possible? Clear. I would say I'm a political scientist, any political candidate who won by that margin, a decisive landslide. So let me, just to be fair to you, if you didn't have to choose, how many would prefer both? Everybody, okay. But you do have to choose in my hypothetical. Now let me begin with my story, okay? So when I was about in your position, my mother had retired in Florida, and she would fly up and visit me. And at the time, airplane jokes were very common. So she told me this joke, and I thought, as I got older and began to teach, this is the perfect literary or joke, comic analogy to what I just asked you. And so here's the story. There's an airplane with 4 passengers on it. The President of the United States, the smartest philosopher in the world, a parish priest, and a hippie. You can see I'm right when the joke was, right? You can about date me now in college. 4 passengers on this plane, and it's about to crash. They can see it coming, and there are only 3 parachutes. 4 passengers, 3 parachutes, plane is about to crash. So the President of the United States gets up and says, I am the leader of the most powerful country in the world. The whole global economy is going to suffer if I don't get out. And he takes a parachute and he jumps. The smartest philosopher gets up next. And he says, I'm the smartest philosopher in the world, and the world counts on me to really understand the meaning of life and what the meaning of the universe is, I must, for the sake of the world, take one, and he takes one, and he jumps. Then the parish priest looks at the hippie, and the hippie gets up and says, you know, which one is it going to be? And the parish priest looks at him and looks at the hippie and says, son, I've devoted my whole life to doing the right thing. Please take one of the parachutes, save your life, and go. And the hippie looks at the parish priest and says, don't worry, Pop. The smartest philosopher in the world just took my knapsack and jumped out of the plane. So that's the story about why you're right, you don't want to have to choose. Even if you have great theories, you need some essential empirical knowledge, right? Otherwise, your theories are going to come to very little. By the way, the philosopher also didn't have very much by way of moral compass either, right? But it's a good story just to drive home the point that you shouldn't want to choose. That yes, you're not going to learn all the facts of the world. You're not going to be able either, by the way, to get the full theory of the world, but bringing the two together is the moral that I take from this airplane story. And so integrated studies is all about bringing together different types of knowledge, insights, and experiences to help us more fully understand the world we live in and our place in it. And it's not going to make you choose between empirical knowledge and theoretical knowledge. Quite the contrary, it's going to show you how important it is to bring the two together. And it's going to show this to you by confronting you with some of the big questions that demand that kind of integration. So this idea that no single discipline, method, or perspective can answer all questions or by itself give us sufficient knowledge of any complex problem has been at the core of Penn's identity all the way back to the original polymath, Benjamin Franklin, who said that education should teach all things ornamental and useful. And by ornamental, he didn't mean just frivolous. He meant the kinds of things that actually make our life joyful and satisfying, not just practical and useful. But he believed that a good education should do both. And that was quite revolutionary at the time. And in each generation, we have discovered anew that the most difficult and important problems cannot be understood, let alone solved, by insulated thinking. So integrated studies takes this insight and elevates it to a very important principle of how to introduce the best, the most talented and hardworking students into a way of learning and thinking that will be maximally useful and creative in your lives. And it's designed to give you a chance to learn and practice how to integrate different kinds of knowledge from a wide variety of disciplines. And those disciplines will run the gamut from the scientific study of human evolution and the physical universe in which we live, to the abstract concepts of philosophy, mathematics, and political theory, to insights into the human predicament that we learn from literature, art, and music, and to the ethical and empirical foundations of various professions that surround you on the campus at Penn. By the way, to be a professional and not understand the ethical and the societal purposes of your profession is absolutely incompatible with being a good professional. And that's why I believe that we also need to integrate a kind of professional education, not the stereotypical kind, but the kind that understands the foundations of the professions, into liberal arts and sciences education. Because you're all, I would dare say, going to become professionals of some kind. So learning to select and apply different kinds of knowledge to a specific problem is one of the most important challenges that you will begin to master through the integrated studies experience. And it is a skill that will be useful both in your careers at Penn and your careers after Penn. So that's one very important reason why integrated studies is the right way to go. Now, there's another equally important reason to integrate our knowledge across disciplines and perspectives, which I hinted at the beginning. We all stand today at the end of a continuing explosion of knowledge and understanding, and it's not going to stop. It's only going to increase exponentially. So the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant suggested that all of human knowledge could be summed up by answering three questions. What can I know? What may I hope? And what ought I to do? Just think about that. What can I know? What may I hope? What ought I to do? And think about how much more complicated the answers to each of those questions have become since Kant wrote centuries ago. You can know much more than you ever could know in previous human history. What may you hope? You can hope more than you ever could hope, but you also have the sobering advantage, and you should think immediately, we're about to celebrate, or to commemorate, I should say, we're about to commemorate the 10th anniversary of 9/11. You also realize that the highest hopes of humankind have been undercut again and again by some of the most heinous acts of hatred that far beyond what any human being in Socrates' time, for example, could have imagined. And what ought I to do? That also has become more and more complicated as your powers have become greater and greater. And most importantly, you need to recognize that the power that Penn students have by virtue of their higher education puts you in an incredibly privileged position in a world where so much is driven by having the kind of knowledge and understanding that higher education begins. So these are the big questions that have driven the development of human knowledge and understanding for centuries. First in philosophy among the ancient Greeks, and Professor Struck really is a wonderful, insightful expert on this. Then in the natural sciences of physics, chemistry, and biology, and I should say also mathematics, Professor de Turck, which goes way back, by the development of rigorous studies of literature, art, music, and culture, and by the emergence of behavioral sciences, of psychology and politics and economics and sociology. And finally, and it did come last in the progression of truly developed knowledge in the professions, such as business, law, medicine came earlier, but for centuries, doctors killed more people than they saved. They really didn't have a knowledge base until biology and chemistry and those disciplines developed, and the discoveries of penicillin, which is only in the previous century. So as each new discipline emerged to examine this or that aspect of human nature in our world, the storehouse of new knowledge grew exponentially. But our knowledge became narrower and more specialized. And that was to be expected, because the tools at humans' disposal did not multiply as fast as the knowledge, and therefore each person picked a specialized tool and dug down deep. And the 20th century, as I think of it, in education was the century of specialized knowledge. By educated human beings showing how much they could do by really getting a discipline right and getting some knowledge right. Earlier than that, it was very broad. So when you go back to the Greeks and all the way up through John Stuart Mill and other philosophers, they tried to have comprehensive. They were not, they did not have the specialized knowledge of organic chemistry, say, or theoretical physics. Or being an expert, let's say, in Jane Austen, but they were very broad. But they didn't have the kind of tools that you now have, that the 20th century brought us, that was specialized. But as knowledge became narrower and more specialized, it became more isolated as well, both from immediate human concerns and problems and from those big questions that were first raised by the Greeks and have been asked by philosophers and just ordinary human beings who've been inquisitive through the ages about the meaning and purpose of human existence. What gives us, and if you think that sounds very abstract, let me make it very, very down to earth. Those questions about meaning and value also play out in our own lives on what will make for a satisfying life. As Denzel Washington, our commencement speaker, said last year, and you may have heard this before, he said how important it is to find a career that's really satisfying, not to just follow the big bucks. He said, remember, no hearse has ever been followed by a U-Haul. You can't take it with you. So you better find the kind of satisfaction in this life, which is the practical way of thinking about the questions that get asked throughout the ages by generalists who ask, what gives meaning? What gives meaning to life? Or if you're a moral philosopher, trained in moral philosophy like I am, what does it mean to live a good life? And how ought I treat my fellow human beings? Or how ought I treat the environment? So as our knowledge has become ever deeper, it has become apparent that no one discipline and no one profession can see the world whole. The big questions cannot be answered from a single perspective. So to understand what I can know, I need the conceptual insights of philosophy as well as empirical data from psychology. And I also need to grasp the barriers faced by computer engineers and cognitive scientists in building an artificial intelligence. To grasp what I might hope, I need to understand the faith of religious beliefs, as well as theories of justice, evolution, and the biological basis of both altruistic and sociopathic behavior. And to decide what I ought to do, I need a well-researched set of moral principles, as well as a firm grasp of the economics of poverty, the sociology of racism, the pragmatism of politics. If I'm a doctor, not only medicine, but the economics of healthcare. And these are the kinds of integrations that you will be encouraged to undertake in this course and in the remainder of your 4 years at Penn, and most importantly, I think, in your careers and your lives post-Penn. Now, that sounds like a tall order, and some of you may be thinking, well, all of that sounds nice, but maybe if this is so demanding, I should have gone to Wharton. Well, there is certainly nothing wrong with going to Wharton. But the truth is that more and more, the Wharton curriculum and the engineering curriculum and the nursing curriculum, in fact, all of our undergraduate programs are being redesigned to encourage the same kind of broad integration of knowledge that you have been chosen for and chosen by becoming an integrated studies student. But integrated studies just happens to be at the forefront of this Penn's distinctive advantage of integrating knowledge. So you will do it better than anybody else, not only at Penn, but anywhere else that I know of in higher education. And by the way, one of the reasons that American higher education is seen around the world as a leader is because we're seen as teaching creativity. When I gave a lecture on global education in China at Shanghai Jiaotong University, the first question that one of your counterparts in China raised her hand and asked me is, and wasn't just asking me, personally, but she used the you. She said, how do you teach creativity? And she was asking the question of, how is it that students at Penn learn to be so creative? She said, here we sit and we learn a lot of facts and knowledge, but we're not taught to question. We're not taught, we don't think we're taught the kind of creativity. And it is true that in worldwide comparisons, there are huge numbers of international students that come to this country and choose higher education here, not because they're going to learn more facts, and not because they're going to get better technical expertise. And mind you, the reason I began with the airplane joke is that's important too. You can't do without it. But our comparative advantage is the kind of integration of that kind of deep knowledge with a breadth of understanding that really cultivates creative thinking. And creative thinking is what leads to innovation. And also, I have to say, I'll say this from a personal perspective, but all kinds of psychological surveys bear this out. It also leads to a much more satisfying life than you would otherwise have. So yes, you've made the right choice, but just because you've made the right choice, don't think for a minute you've made the easy choice. It is the right choice because it's not the easy choice. And analyzing the world from the perspective of one discipline or one methodological perspective, such as, and let me name you a few just so you realize that these exist: cost-benefit analysis, a highly developed methodological perspective. The challenge, it's good to know what it is. Indeed, you can't understand a lot of what goes on in the world if you don't understand it. It's bad to think it's the only way to approach any problem in life. Or, from my field, human rights. A human rights perspective, often traced back to Immanuel Kant. It is you can't live a life of an informed citizen in this country or the world without understanding human rights. But if all you understand is human rights, you do not have a sufficiently broad understanding of the world. Or historical relativism. If you're a historian, you can understand how different values were across time. But if that's the way you look at all issues of values, you will have had a limited worldview that will not only, in my mind, be limited and to that extent misleading, but will also limit you in your creative ability to understand and tackle some of the big problems. So integrating knowledge is demanding. It's a little like, let me pick something from, again, when I was, something from my lifetime, which you've probably heard of. It's a little like working to land the first man on the moon. And let me just go back to the 1960s when I was in high school. The United States mobilized its finest minds and its greatest organizational savvy to land a man on the moon. Indeed, land men on the moon. And that was a feat of integrating knowledge. theoretical physicists, chemists and biologists, physicians, emergent, just nascent computer scientists and engineers. They all came together to tackle a single big problem, and it was very hard. And President Kennedy said when he committed the nation to doing this, and I quote, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skill." And that's precisely the right analogy for integrated studies. It is hard, and you're doing it because it's hard, because by virtue of being hard, the kind of hard it is that it will not only measure, but it will mobilize the best of your talents and skills and your energies. And that's going to enable you to address problems, to understand and address problems that in the 1960s it was not even possible to begin to understand and address. Like President Kennedy, you've made a choice. And I don't want you to think, this is your first day of classes, you're excited, you're here. That's great, and I want to underline how that excitement is not only subjective, but there's an objective underpinning to it. You are truly pioneers the same way that President Kennedy was a pioneer in saying we're going to land men on the moon. You've chosen the hard, perhaps the hardest, the most exciting, and potentially the most illuminating work. I truly believe this, and I've spent my whole career proving that this is true, and you've just taken it, and I thank the organizers of integrated studies, to another level by starting as freshmen. You've undertaken this work of seeing life not only in its parts, but also as a whole problem and a worthy set of challenges. And that's the mission of liberal arts and sciences. You will develop a mindset of knowledge, insights, and modes of thinking that can be applied to any problem. And you'll find yourself, like I have found myself, in just finding that this toolkit, this integrated toolkit, is of enormous use no matter what you do in your careers. So where do you begin? Let me suggest that you should begin by thinking globally. But I don't mean globally in quite the way the ordinary way of global. So one common meaning of the word global refers to the entire world of nations, cultures, and geography. We say, for example, that we compete in a global economy. The United Nations is a global body. We are confronting global climate change and so on. But there's another meaning of the word global, one that's directly relevant to your work here in integrated studies. And global also means comprehensive or total. And global in this sense encompasses the sum of all the roles we play in our lives, all of the academic disciplines, all of the different modes of thinking that you will be exposed to. To think globally in this sense is to use all parts of your brain. We must develop our global cognitive abilities and interpersonal capacities in order to make the best judgments and decisions in today's complex world. In other words, we need to rely on global thinking to be most responsible and most successful. And how do you do that? Well, there are 4 types of thinking which I distilled from a psychologist, Howard Gardner, which you use for that. One is disciplinary thinking, and you're all going to major in something, and that will give you disciplinary thinking. The second mode of thinking is what Gardner calls synthesizing thinking. It has the power to integrate knowledge and ideas from different disciplines, and integrated studies is directly aimed at synthesizing. The third, creative thinking, harnesses the power of both disciplinary and synthesizing and moves you forward to be able to get new ideas and new solutions to problems. And again, integrated studies is going to help you do that by not waiting not just doing this theoretically, but actually confronting you with some big issues that the disciplinary and synthesizing together will move forward into a creative way. And the fourth kind of thinking is ethical thinking, and it's thinking beyond our immediate personal, professional, and group interests, and to respect other people, to consider the impact of our decisions and actions on others. And that's why yesterday, when I was addressing you, the whole class, I urged you to contribute, to find ways of contributing to some communities while you're here at Penn, because it is really important that disciplinary synthesizing and creative thinking are used for good ends to help the world move forward, not just for selfish ends. Because if you take away the ethical part of the thinking, just think about it. You could be extraordinarily smart, both in disciplinary terms, in synthesizing terms, and in creative terms, and use it all for absolutely horrific ends. So without the ethical thinking, to go back to part of what you're going to do with your lives, you can't be a responsible professional. And by the way, you probably won't be successful either, because people who are incredibly clever but don't have an ethical compass usually think they can get away with things until they don't. And that's why, just to digress for a moment, Plato had this, who was a master of Socrates, who he wrote about, was a master at questioning. And the question asked that captured the ultimate of whether you had a sense of what ethics was if I gave you a ring, it was called Gyges ring, and you could wear, and nobody would find out about what you would do. What would you do? Would you engage in helping other people, or would you engage in the ultimate evil, selfish acts? And it's an interesting thought experiment to have. Should we be ethical only because of what we can gain in reputation, or are there intrinsic reasons for doing it? So these are just to give you some sense of the four ways of thinking. When I say you're going to use all parts of your brain, there are names you can put on these ways of thinking, which will be essential to the hard work of global education offered by integrated studies. So I asked where to begin, and I said, you begin, understanding what this global form, comprehensive education, means. So let me update Kant's 3 questions and give you 3 other questions that I think you'll be able to better answer through this course. One is, where do I come from? The second is, who am I? And the third is, what should I do next? And they're very specific questions that are not easy to answer. So where do I come from is a question about your rootedness. And I don't mean just your family histories, but also broadly shared political, cultural histories, our biological and evolutionary origins. They're fascinating, and you can't understand yourself unless you know where you come from. So that's rootedness. Second question, who am I? I've written a book on democracy and identity to show how much our identity is actually tied up in our citizenship. But answering the question, who am I, will lead you to develop a stronger sense of your identity. And what you will discover is individual identity is never singular. So who am I? Philadelphia Magazine asked me as the first question. They did a little question and answer with me, and they asked who am I, and who am I? I'm Penn's president, I'm a woman, I'm a Jewish American, I'm a political philosopher, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, And you could go, I could go on and on. You could do the same for you, but that's only scratching the surface. When I say, who am I also think about my values, my hopes, my dreams, my aspirations, much of the answers to the questions that Kant asked. I think this course will help you answer that question too, because it will help see what your intellectual passions are. So that's identity. So rootedness and identity, two first questions. And they lead to the third, and I think it's the most exciting and challenging question for you as freshmen. What should I do next? And I don't mean whether you're going to have cookies with Dennis DeTurk tonight, or not even what courses you're going to sign up for next semester. But I do mean, what kind of profession it will inspire me? What do I think I want to do with my life? And you don't ask that once and for all, so you do ask it, what's next? And let me just, since I want to give plenty of time for questions, let me give you an example, a Penn example of how these kinds of questions, what do I do next, tie in directly to what you're going to learn in this course. A Penn graduate and trustee, Howard Marks, who has contributed greatly to a Marks writing program at Penn, he's not only a successful CEO of a global investment company, but he's also, he's somebody I've gotten to know and become friends with. He's also an avid writer. He's a fabulous writer. He's a very creative thinker, and he's a true leader in the investment world. And he is a graduate of Wharton. But he has resisted the crowd mentality that contributed to the Great Recession. And he didn't do it accidentally. When he talks and he writes about what changed his life at Penn, it was not principles of accounting or introduction to finance. What truly changed his life was Japanese literature, which he took in the college. And he minored in Japanese studies, and that is not incidental to his outlook on life or his contributions to society. And when Howard distills his philosophy of investment, he refers to what he learned not in accounting, not in finance, but in studying Japanese literature. And he says, we have to adapt and accommodate rather than think that everything's within our control. In one of his widely read, and it's beautifully written, memos on the market, he quotes Lao Tzu, though he might as well have been describing Hurricane Irene. And here's what he says. To be strong, you have to be like water. If there are no obstacles, it flows. If there is an obstacle, it stops. If a dam is broken, then it flows further. If a vessel is square, then it has a square form. If a vessel is round, then it has a round form. Because it is so soft and flexible, it is the most necessary and the strongest thing. Now, having a great education for some people means that they can triumph over everything, that they can control everything. And that I dare say a lot of people who thought the bubble would never burst thought that because they had an inflated sense not only of the market, but their own sense of controlling everything. And what Howard Marks learned, not after the Great Recession, but before it, and he was one of the people who was saying, don't think this is a bubble, it's going to burst, is that we also have to understand the limits of our power, and what the power of water was a metaphor for him. You have to understand the world enough to know what you can and what you cannot change and control. Such openness to change is an essential part of integrating knowledge. The creative capacities of the human mind coupled with the ability to integrate our exponentially expanding storehouse of knowledge and an openness to insights and new approaches, and that willingness to go against the crowd mentality because you have insights that come through a broad as well as a deep education. That is what integrated studies is designed to do. And I hope you all remain excited about it as it becomes harder and harder, and realize that integrated studies is meant to be hard, but it also is, and I say this with as much confidence as somebody who believes that we shouldn't be overly confident should have. This is the best kind of undergraduate education that is available in the world. You're going to master some discipline, and you're going to couple it with a synthetic grasp of tools that give you an appreciation of big problems, and it will give you the best of both intellectual worlds. The global thinking coupled with analytical rigor that will prepare you to know from where you have come, who you are, and where you want to go next. And just remember that you don't have to believe that you can do everything. Indeed, if you're wise, like Socrates was, and like Howard Marks is in a totally different realm, you will get a lot of advantage in your life and in this course by asking questions and knowing what you don't know. So I say, let your intellectual journey begin, and let the hard work begin, and let your questions begin. And thank you so very much for being such an attentive guest.